We haven't talked a great deal about hydrogen, and certainly within the automotive press and in general, hydrogen has fallen out of favor in recent years. But it does seem that the manufacturers have been continuing to push work there. There is a fair bit happening in California. How optimistic is CARB at this point that in the outer years, or the further out in the ZEV phase out to 2025, that hydrogen begins to pick up some of the slack?
Very optimistic, and I think that's illustrated in the graph that I showed of how we get to 80% reduction in 2025. You'll notice in that graph, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles were dominating the marketplace, and that was for two reasons. One, when we did the cost analysis, we showed that fuel cell technology continues down the cost curve as production increases to a much lower point than batteries do. And that's primarily because there it's an engineering challenge and a production challenge, whereas with batteries, it's those plus materials. You can come farther down with fuel cells. The second is that manufacturers and consumers are accustomed to a broad range of technology models available in the marketplace. Everything from your small commuter cars to your sedans to small SUVs, minivans, and pickup trucks. The larger platforms are much more cost effective if you're talking about fuel cell technology than with battery. You can put a fuel cell in an SUV much more cost effectively than a battery. Mm-hmm. So this provides a broader range of model availability.
And Costa, I think you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so just regarding hydrogen and the benefits of hydrogen, as Annalisa was saying, is that you can have a traditional type of longer range vehicle that drives with zero emissions from the tailpipe. I guess back to when Alan anointed me R&D director, what I would want to see is there hasn't been a very large discussion about the greenhouse gases associated with creating hydrogen, right? So hydrogen needs to be made from something, right? And right now we make it almost entirely from reforming natural gas. And that reduces emissions relative to conventional vehicles, but it gets us nowhere near 80% below traditional technologies. And as Alan's saying, is as we get traditional technologies improving, that's only going to get, go the other way. So I think that there needs to be a lot more attention of, if hydrogen vehicles succeed, what is going to be the low-cost, low-carbon source of hydrogen for the country? And whether it's some sort of renewable-based electrolysis or some nuclear-based electrolysis. And those are kind of seen, I think, in at least what in my view, everybody's looking at that as a future issue to be dealt with once we get the cars right. Well, so let's say we get the cars right, and now it's 2025, and now we have to embark on another giant research program to figure out how to get hydrogen produced low carbon and low cost, because right now it's not. Right?
California is addressing that with Senate Bill 1505 that requires hydrogen used as a transportation fuel to meet specific environmental requirements. We're in the process of developing the regulations that go around that, but it will require 50% reduction in criteria pollutants, 33% reduction in GHG emissions, and 30% use of renewables for all of hydrogen used as a transportation fuel. So we're sending those signals today.
Good.
that R&D has to take place. Those production strategies and pathways need to be developed commercially.
I think it might be good to pivot a little bit now to a topic we haven't touched on quite as much. And Annalisa, this would also fall to you as our regulatory expert here. But in the early 2000s and up through 05 or 06, clearly pretty acrimonious relationship with the industry and car dealers in California. I lost count of the number of federal lawsuits that were filed year after year after year trying to block different programs that CARB wanted to implement. And that has largely dissipated. And I thought it was remarkable at the hearing in January when the final rules were announced, the lack of overt threat of lawsuits coming from any member of the auto industry, which again, if you cast your mind back 10 years, that was quite amazing. And we've seen harmonization at the federal level in terms of what EPA is doing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of the confluence of both CARB policy now and CAFE and some of the federal regulations.
Well, California has recognized that if we only succeed in commercializing zero-emission vehicles in California, we haven't succeeded. We're big, but we're not that big. We really need to see this technology commercialized nationally, internationally, in order to make a significant difference, especially for GHG emissions. But when we started regulating GHG emissions with passage of the Pavley bill 2003, 2004, and adopted regulations at the state level to regulate tailpipe emissions or vehicle emissions of GHG pollutants, we really needed to see that happen nationally as well, and started working with the federal government at that point. We were initially denied our waiver to implement that program. We were sued over that regulation as well. But when the tide turned in Washington towards a willingness to regulate GHG emissions from motor vehicles, that we started working very collaboratively with the federal government. They adopted our regulations. We harmonized with a deemed to comply provision in our California Pavley regulations so that manufacturers could comply nationally with GHG standards. And then our work in this last couple of years with the federal government, both EPA and NHTSA, to harmonize our regulations and use common research and common negotiation with the car companies really was a fundamental change and a great success. With our adoption of the regulations in January that cover criteria pollutants, greenhouse gases, and ZEVs, and then the federal government's release of their national rule, and I understand it was finalized yesterday in the Federal Register. We're now headed towards our deemed to comply regulatory hearing in November that will allow manufacturers to comply nationally with one national standard. I think the car companies were very concerned when we were adopting Pavley that this was further alienating and isolating California. It's easier to comprehend compliance nationally, and from a fairness and a equalizing the burden of compliance across the whole nation. And we're hearing from car companies that there's a demand to make cars cleaner, and as Jeremy says, they want everything. They want they want a cleaner, more efficient car, but they want all of the other bells and whistles as well. So there does seem to be a change in the demand from consumers towards more advanced technologies, and that's shifting the perception. That's sort of, if you haven't got technology in this space, you're not a car company worth walking into a showroom for.
Jeremy, did you
whether
want to,
or not you buy the car.
Did you have some thoughts you wanted to share?
Well, I can speak in general, I guess, from the industry perspective, because I think, as we were just hearing, there was a lot of concern about California having one set of standards and maybe other states following California, but the country as a whole having a different set of standards, and that imposes a huge degree of uncertainty and cost on the car companies. Mm-hmm. I also think that there's just a general recognition that in the past, the resistance that you were talking about really wasn't that productive, and I think that the optics on this have changed. I think that car companies to be, sort of publicly positioning themselves against the environment or better fuel efficiency is probably not that smart of a move. So I think that has created a better environment for discussion about these things. I do think, though, that when you talk to the car companies, it's not like they're not concerned about where the regulations are going. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how they're going to meet the regulations as we get later into the decade and certainly into the next decade. So I think it's a much healthier relationship now between the industry and government, but there's still a lot of stress involved in trying to figure out how to meet the regulations.
And that brings me to, I guess, one of the last main topics I'd like to raise at this juncture. We have a debate tonight, and there's an election coming up very soon. Now, we've just talked about what's on the books and where things are headed, but after November 6th. There are multiple possible outcomes. The current administration is retained. The current congressional structure is maintained with one party in the Senate and one party in the House. Another possibility is that we have a new administration coming in, the same split in Congress, or perhaps we get one party running everything. And these obviously can lead to some major shifts in public policy. There are a great many critics of the CAFE program and the new rules that have been put out there. This is entirely speculative, I realize at this point, but given these different possible outcomes, how, what is the fate of ZEV 6 months from now if we see a shift at the federal level?
I'm not sure how to answer that. California has operated under a waiver allowing us to adopt regulations different from the federal government so long as they're protective of public health. We've had our hearing with the EPA last month asking for our waiver on the current amendments. So we're waiting to hear how that comes out. Mm-hmm. But with that, we go forward as allowed. I don't believe any precedent for the federal government changing that decision after it's been made. And we just continue to operate with ZEV along with our sister states. In terms of what the federal government does to facilitate implementation, that could change very dramatically. Mm-hmm. In terms of the tax credit, incentives under the GHG regulations for battery electric vehicles, things like that. But I'm not sure the car companies would necessarily want those things to change now that they've been set.
Yeah, I wonder, Costa, do you have any sense, I mean, you mentioned there's the benefit of having a framework in place that whether the manufacturers like it or not, they know what the guidelines are. If the tables were turned or changed a little bit, would there be some pushback from the industry in that case?
Well, I don't know if I can speak for the industry, but I would imagine that because of the vehicle cycles in car companies, design cycles last for multiple years, and then cars are on the road for 12 to 18 years. A lot of the inertia would remain, I would imagine, no matter what the micro changes at the national policy level are. The long-term version of this is toward an economy that uses less oil in its transportation sector. Still some oil in the transportation sector, but less. And the reason why is because right now we use 95% of the transportation sector is powered by oil, which leaves the economy vulnerable to changes in oil price. And also, so I think that the best way to enhance energy security, and studies from the Congressional Budget Office and us and others have said, diversify fuels in the transportation mix. So I think that is a message that is fairly bipartisan and that will continue to move forward. Now the mechanisms, and whether it's a regulation or tax or another approach, at the micro level that will obviously change. But I think, when we come back to the 2020 Toyota FMS, I still think that we would see more advanced technology, less reliance on oil in the transportation sector than we have now, regardless of what the near-term political aspirations are.